Thomas Green here with the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. On the episode today, we have Jake Morgan. Hello, Jake.
Hello.
And a special guest by the name of Eran Katz. Eran, welcome.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, as you said, my name is Eran Katz. I am a clinical psychologist. I live in Israel, in the center of Israel, and where I practice psychology. I have a private practice, and also I'm in the process of working on my PhD thesis. And in between, I'm talking about everything related to parenting. I have two kids. One is I have an 8-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. I like to say that they are my best teachers when it comes to parenting because they do take me to school kind of every day. And I love them for that. And they challenge me and they reward me. And it's, parenting, I think it's a one hell of a journey and a developmental journey. And so I've started thinking about writing about, creating a podcast about parenting in the last couple of year or a little bit before COVID started, which feels like ages ago. And yeah, so this is what I am about right now.
Thank you for the introduction.
Great. Could I just I know I say I'm trying not to be very vocal because I have a bit of a sore throat. But I'm really curious. You say you're currently doing a PhD thesis. What is it about? What is it on?
Well, it's actually not related to parenting per se, but I am involved in a research about how couples are dealing with medical issues. Especially in my research, we are looking into romantic couples where the man had a heart attack and now they have to go through cardiac rehabilitation and all the different lifestyle changes that it entails. And usually it's the man who gets the heart attack and the woman who has to kind of take care of him. So I'm looking into the relationship and how it influences and affects their coping behaviors, especially when it comes to their how they take care of each other. I'm just right now in the process of writing our first paper, and we're seeing a very interesting effect because usually we think of, in this case, one patient and one caregiver. And what we're seeing is that it's a known fact, it's a known research, something we see in studies, that the caregivers, whether it's the wife of a patient or the husband of a patient, or maybe sometimes it's children who take care of their parents, caregiving takes its toll. We know it also from parenting, but it's a different aspect of caregiving, and it brings about mental health issues and physical burden. And what we're seeing is that the ways that the couples are communicating, and especially how in my case, the husband, who is the patient, also kind of supports his wife in this process, really helps her to feel better, less burdened, which is something we want to achieve, to reduce the burden of the caregivers. So that's my focus in this research.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome.
Well, in the messages prior to the conversation, you say that you have a mission to help parents become their best selves so that they'll raise secure and confident children. How do you go about doing that?
I think that's a very good and tough and broad question. Maybe it's a little bit cheesy to say, but I kind of feel like, when one thinks about his or her life's mission, I think this is one of mine, of trying to figure out how parents can be better parents and also create a better experience for themselves as parents and for the children. My vision is that I would like to have a world where children grow up and they become confident, happy, empathetic adults. Mainly, I want to live in a world that people like me, psychologists, are not really needed, and I think it's far-fetched, and I don't think this is really attainable, but I do think that parenting has a very profound effect on how we grow up and how children, we start as children, then we become adults. And I see it every day in my practice, because I started as a child psychologist, but I transitioned with time to mainly work with adult clients. But I see the inner child in them. I see how experiences from 20, 30, sometimes even longer periods of time ago affect their daily lives today, in their jobs, in their romantic relationships. And I started to focus on what we can do today as parents or people who help parents, and to maybe minimize, the negative effects of some practices of misattunement between parents and children. And as I said, I think parenting is really, it's a long journey, it's a life journey, and it's not an easy one, especially today when you have so many mixed messages in the media and in social media and all that. I think that when I was a child, my mom, if she wanted some advice about, parenting, she had like Dr. Spock book, and maybe she could consult with her friends and her mom. That was like the social get up for that. And today, just Google something and you get a trillion zillion ideas, and some of them contradict themselves. And I think one of the things that I want to help, in this regard, is to kind of, in a way, minimize the confusement. So, I offer my view on parenting and how parenting can look like, and also help, especially the parents themselves, feel better about themselves and make a transition in themselves about how they approach parenting, how they approach the children, by understanding themselves better, how their mind works as parents, and also how the minds of their children work, so they can communicate better. I just say that as a psychologist, I come from the attachment perspective. I use it in my research. I use attachment informed practices in therapy. That's the viewpoint I bring also to parenting, because I think, everyone who's about positive parenting and positive relationship with the child is really about helping the child feel secure in a relationship.
It's not something that we've covered on the podcast. So do you want to share kind of the fundamentals of attachment theory?
Yeah, I'll try to make it, as specific as possible, because it's a topic for a long podcast series. But attachment theory, like in a nutshell, was started by a British psychoanalyst, John Bowlby, and also his colleague Mary Ainsworth from the US. And he was a psychoanalyst, so he worked with children, but he started to think about how the environment shapes children's behavior and feeling, which is something that psychoanalysis in that time, I'm talking about early 40s, 50s of the 20th century, they weren't really focused on that. And he developed this theory of how the communication and the relationship between a mother and her baby, and then later the father as well, is shaping how the baby sees the world. So if a parent is attuned to the child, responsive to the child, sensitive to the child's cues, especially at the beginning, the cues of the child are crying, cooing, all everything around that, and later on with verbal speech as well, the child will come to really internalize the notion that I'm safe in the world. There's someone who here is taking care of me, because we humans are unique in that regard. We need someone to take care of us for a long period of time. And when I feel as a baby with no language yet, but and then as a child, when I feel and internalize the notion that my feelings are valid and my needs are valid, and there's someone here who really sees me and takes care of me, even when we disagree, I can feel safer in the world, and I feel like I can take care of myself. And I'll just add that one fundamental principle here is that we all humans have a need, like it's in our nature to explore the world. This is why we kind of like took over the world by going places. And we see it with children. You put a baby in a room with toys, he'll start to explore everything around him or her. But we need to feel safe in order to go out and explore. And the parent gives the child the first secure base from which you can go out into the world and explore. And that means also as a child, when you go to school and you get to meet new friends, it's a type of exploration. Also, when you get to learn about your emotions, sometimes you're sad, sometimes you're angry, that's another type of exploration. And sometimes when we do that, we bump our head into something, we fall off the slide, we get hurt by a friend, and then we need someone that we can go back to and get a hug from, whether it's a physical hug or a kiss where maybe we got a scrape in our knee. And sometimes it's a kind of not a virtual, like, and maybe a virtual hug, like with our words, consolement and all that. And this is what we call a safe haven. So it's kind of a circle. Like we start from a secure base, we go out in the world, and then we go back when we need someone to help us. And it starts with our parents, and then it moves, the attachment figures kind of transitions to our peers as teenagers, and then to our romantic relationships and our friends. And this is why I think when we as parents, we need to create a very good base for our children, so that when they eventually go out into the world and they won't really need us anymore, they could take care of themselves and their spouses and their children, etc.
That seems really, really absolutely fundamental to me. But one of the things that I've come across recently is sort of a debate, I guess, around when babies are crying. Mm-hmm. Should you comfort them or should you let them cry themselves out? Because I very strongly come from the belief system that you should always comfort your children. But I guess you could argue that you're training them to cry in order to get that attention. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah. And my thoughts are practically where you stand, I think, because I don't believe that babies cry in order to get something, like in a manipulative kind of way. When we think that, I believe that we kind of project our own, adult schemas onto them. They're nonverbal creatures. This is what they can do. When they're cold, they will cry. When they're hungry, they will cry. Yes, we teach them that when they cry, we are there for them to comfort them. Yeah. And I do think that, and I am sure that the research shows it as well. When you let a baby cry, and we need to differentiate, maybe I'll just add, between, if it takes a minute or two to get to the baby, or to give or prepare the bottle with the formula, whatever, it's not the same as letting the baby cry himself to sleep or cry himself to relaxation, because when we do that, we actually teach the baby that there's no one here to take care of that, of him or her. This is what usually creates what we call avoidant attachment, which means when I learn as a baby, let's say that I can have this, more complex thinking, that when I learn that my mom or dad are not there really to help me when I'm crying, I learned that I can't trust anyone and I don't need anyone. And that's why we see, all this, sometimes as adults, self-reliant people, which is kind of amazing, and they drive the world sometimes. But when it comes to their innermost feelings and intimate relationships, usually they, sometimes they run havoc. And that's because there's a very fundamental rule here, that if I'm in distress, no one is there to take care of me. Hence, I cannot share anyone with my distress. Hence, I'm alone. That's why I don't think that there's any question here that should you or should you not comfort your baby. Now, we need to think about the context, and we need to realize that babies develop with time, and sometimes it's okay to open more gaps between their cry or their ask and our response. If there's a window of tolerance here, now when they're very, very young, we need to approach them faster. Then we can take a little bit more time, because this is how they learn to differentiate between themselves and ours, and to withstand some, I don't know if we should call it suffering, but to withstand some waiting time. And that's also important to learn, because I think when people say that you teach the baby to manipulate you, or you'll make him spoiled, that's something it's used to say. I just don't believe that's true. Not in those early years. It's okay later on, I think, when your baby can understand, when your child can understand language, to let them know that they can have everything they want, because it's not the same when a baby is crying and you let him cry himself to sleep. It's not the same as when you go with you 4 years old to the grocery store and you don't agree to buy her a lollipop, for example. It's not the same thing, even if she cries, and then you don't give her what she wants. But I do think you need to comfort her. So basically, it's all about how you handle their emotions. You don't have to give in to what they want, but you do have to take care of their emotions. That's what I believe.
Thank you for the in-depth explanation. It was a great answer. Coming back shortly to attachment theory. You said about one example about the avoidant attachment. If it is the case that someone is, for example, avoidant, I'm aware that there are other examples, but would you necessarily say that it is quote unquote wrong, or would you say that you attempt to address that through, for example, therapy? And if someone did want to change, let's say you have an avoidant person who's showing those signs, what would you recommend?
So I wouldn't necessarily call it wrong, because I don't like to use this type of judgmental language, and it basically depends on the person. And I have to say that studies show that approximately in almost every culture you check these things, approximately 60 to 70% of babies have a secure attachment. So I wouldn't say that the rest of the 30 to 40% are in a wrong place, but sometimes they do suffer. So if someone, I never had anyone come into my clinic to tell me that I have an avoidant attachment. Maybe I checked it up online with some questionnaire or something, and I want to treat that. That never happened. But sometimes you get people coming in and, something is wrong with their lives. Maybe they can't maintain a romantic relationship, or they have trouble like with relationships with their parents or at work. And then once you realize that it has something to do with their insecure attachment, whether it be the avoidant attachment or the other prevalent kind, which is anxious attachment, I would suggest that not that it's wrong, but it causes them to suffer, and there is something to do about it. We do know from therapy, and also not only from therapy, sometimes all it takes is getting into a relationship with someone who is securely attached with himself, who has a secure attachment. And like in a relationship, when if you have a girlfriend who can give you this secure place, which is different from the type of relationships you had with your parents or other attachment figures in your past, then you can transition into a less avoidant place. And it can be attainable with a relationship like that. It can be attainable in therapy. And I will just add that today in the research and practice of attachment theory, we kind of moved away from talking categorically, like you're either avoidant or you're secure. We're talking more about patterns. So you can see little different patterns. You can be securely attached to your mom and insecurely attached to your dad, for example, or have an insecure attachment to your parents, but develop more secure attachment patterns later on. It's more fluid in that sense. But I do think that insecure attachment can cause mental health issues, physical issues. We know that from research, from long-term research that has been conducted, and it's changeable. it definitely is changeable if you meet the right person in the right time, or if you go to therapy with someone that can give you a safer place, to be yourself, to express your emotions, and to be held in a way that maybe you weren't held before.
It's a positive message. Thank you for that. In terms of, I know that you said you're not a child psychologist anymore, but in terms of the common problems that you frequently had to deal with, what would you say some of the main ones are, and perhaps how you go about solving them?
Well, I think one of the main things that we could see, at least in my practice and my colleagues working with children, there's a lot of anxiety. I live in a very stressful country, Israel. I love this place and it's beautiful and all that, but it's also can be very stressogenic sometimes, especially in specific periods of time. And so we can see a lot of anxiety and what we psychologists sometimes call external behaviors. So anger and not very violent behavior, but children getting into fights at school or being disrespectful to their teachers. And there are many reasons for these problems, but if I can distill that my experience, and maybe one of the things that led me to kind of move away from working with children to working with adults and also with parents, is the notion that a lot of those problems come from, the way I see it, come from not because the child has a problem, but because it's a systems problem. So child feels unseen and unheard in his family or her school, and we want to work on the system. So sometimes it really boils down into how parents approach the child who's expressing a behavior that isn't acceptable by school or by the parents themselves. And I had to sometimes do a lot of psychoeducation and helping parents broaden their ideas and the scopes of what is acceptable for children's behavior, understanding that children and adults are not the same. They don't have this, we have developed brain that we worked on for 20 something years at least, and they don't. And we know today that the brains of human beings take about 20 something years to develop, especially in those areas that are related to impulse control and all that. And so a lot of the problems came from parents who didn't know how to handle, understand, and approach children in a very helpful way. And that sometimes not specifically maybe caused their anxiety or their external behaviors, but augmented them.
Wow, I always think, yeah, it's curious because parenting is such an important thing. In fact, as you suggested earlier on, a lot of adult problems stem from some issues that were unresolved, or that they felt insecure or something from when they were young. But in no school that I've ever come across, in no school system, is there any specific training about how to become a parent or an effective parent. So it's mostly anecdotal training or passed down from previous generations, or like you say, just flicking around the internet and trying to find some advice, which might not be good advice. So yeah, I mean, is there something that you would recommend for parents under the circumstances that you mentioned, to help them overcome these problems, other than something that they could do in the house? If they had a child, for example, that had some kind of attachment issues, or rather felt insecure, or didn't feel that they got the support that they perhaps should do, what can parents do in the house to start alleviating those problems and fixing them?
Yeah, so the end of my answer would be that in some cases you need to consult a therapist, because sometimes, and that's especially true when the attachment, suffering is very high, and it's something we see especially when children had traumatic past. We see it in foster care, in adopted children, and all that. But in any cases where it's very, where it's intense, get a therapist who knows something about attachment theory and therapies that are attachment informed. And maybe the work is needed to be done with the child, maybe with the parents, usually some kind of combination. But in quote unquote lighter cases, I would suggest that parents start to open their minds and kind of learn and educate themselves about how, quote unquote, how children's work. There's no manual for every child in the world, unfortunately. But there are some principles, because we know about development. We know about how the human mind works, at least enough to understand how we affect our children. And I do believe that if parents are committed to that and grab a book, learn, listen to podcasts such as yours or mine or others, there are people who are focused on that, and you can learn quite a bit from reading or listening. And when you get a nice understanding about the differences between the adult brain and the child's brain, and how to approach a child in a more sensitive, empathetic, holding, caring way, that it's worth a lot. It will take everything to a very different and much better place. So this is where I'll start. Now, if it's not enough, you can work with someone who, because every family is unique and every child is unique, and every sometimes parents have their own traumatic histories and all that. So you sometimes need to have some more specific guidance or therapy to help you break through those places. But this is where I start.
Great. Yeah, I can imagine parents, that's a good point, that may have had their own sort of unresolved traumatic or post-traumatic more traumatic issues that happened to them, and they've just kind of carrying that along to the next generation. So that kind of, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a close family member who they're struggling to get their child to eat. Have you ever come across that before, and what advice would you give that person?
I come across it every day with my daughter. She's very persistent and very assertive about her decisions, whether to eat or not, when she's gonna eat or not, and what she's gonna eat or what she's not gonna eat. So I feel the pain. And I think it's the answer for that is that it really depends on the situation. And I would suggest to consult someone who knows his or her way around diet for children, like what the condition is and how problematic it is, because sometimes when it comes to food and feeding and eating, we parents project a lot of our inner beliefs and past history on that, and it can become into a mini or not so mini war around control issues. This is what we want to avoid, because we don't want it to evolve into some kind of eating disorder which are usually around control issues. So first, check that everything's okay, medically speaking, and that the diet, is okay, and get some help from someone who's, a child nutritionist or someone who's versed around those issues, because usually it's about behavioral issues. And for the parents themselves, I would suggest, again, thinking about how we can open ourselves to more understanding the child and differentiating ourselves from the child. Because, when my daughter doesn't eat her dinner, or she chooses to eat only plain rice with nothing else, it really frustrates me as someone who likes to eat, likes to enjoy food, and also wants to see her growing up. But it took me, I think, for the last year, to realize that she is still growing up even if she doesn't eat like me. Now I'm trying to, instead of like trying to control what she eats, and try to get myself more into a more accepting place, while also challenging her by offering other types of food, helping her taste stuff, really reinforcing it when she does, and understanding that it's an ongoing process, and B, children really change, and a picky eater doesn't have to stay a picky eater for the rest of their lives, because sometimes children surprise us with how they change. And I think parenting is really for the long haul. So maybe it's not easy now, it's going to change later, but it boils down, I believe, to the kind of mindset that you as a parent adopt. If you approach every meal like a battlefield, it's going to feel like a battlefield, and most likely you're going to lose. If you approach it in a different place, from a different place, without giving up on wanting your child to eat and be healthy and all that, you may have more success.
Thank you for clarifying that. Do you mind sharing about your parenting map?
Yeah, sure. So the parenting map started from when I wanted to think about how I can help first myself and some of my friends who consulted with me, or my clients, and then other parents in this journey. And it started from I think you, Jake, you mentioned that we don't teach parenting in schools. We have to learn it from experience, and from we learn a lot from our own parents sometimes. And the way I like to think about it is to think about a ship. Like when you became a parent for the first time, it's like someone handed you a very nice ship that you have to take care of, and now you're instantly the captain of that ship. It's not like you had to pull yourself up through the ranks, learning as you go along. You're now the captain of this nice ship, and it has a very precious cargo, which is your family, and it's up to you to take that ship to where you want to take it, especially to make sure it's safe. And I figured that when you're trying to sail, you need a map to help you along the way. That's how the parenting map came to be, and it actually stands for it has 3 pillars. The map is actually an acronym. So the first one is your mind, then there's attachment and purpose. And if I can break it a little bit down every one for you, I like to start with the purpose, because it's about what is meaningful for you in life. What values are you trying to live by, and how you want your life to look like. And values or purpose, your purpose is not something like it's not something you can totally achieve and tick off your to-do list. So if one of my values is I want to be a present father, a supportive father, I will never cease trying to do that till the day I die. But it's like a North Star for me. And the way I conduct myself with my children, at least most of the time, I try to do it in light of my values. And the same goes for other areas of life. So that's what is important about the purpose pillar. And then the attachment pillar is all we talked about before, how you communicate with your child to help and make your child feel supported, safe emotionally and physically with you. So it really stems from attachment theory and practice and other ways that explain and understand how children understand us both verbally and non-verbally. There's a lot of non-verbal communication that we need to take care of. And when we approach discipline and taking care of our children when they're stressed and all that from an attachment committed place, we help them feel more safe, even when we have to deal with negative emotions, even when we are angry with them. I always tell my children that if I'm angry with you, it doesn't mean I don't love you, vice versa. I mean, sometimes I'm angry with you the same way you're angry with me sometimes. We still love each other, we still care about each other. And the mind pillar is really about understanding your mind as a parent, understanding what are your beliefs about children, about parenting, and how some of your thoughts and beliefs may hurt your positive wishes to be like a perfect parent. So sometimes you need to let go of some of your beliefs, or sometimes you want to learn how to regulate your own stress and emotion in order to be more present and available to your child. So that's where the mind pillar comes to place. So I think we have to start with understanding what kind of parents we want to be, and then we need to get into a better place with our own minds. And from that place, we can move into working on the attachment relationship with our children, because we are more able to regulate ourselves and approach those meaningful moments from a more open place and more sustainable place.
Without doing like a social experiment on them, is there a way of knowing what kind of attachment your children have? And have you done it yourself?
Well, there are official psychology experiments and tests, and the main one is called the strange situation, and this is when you go with your child and when they're like 1 year old to a laboratory, and it's special. Basically, it's like a social gathering, and from that the researcher can see whether the child is secure or attached or not. And I wouldn't do anything else, like just as myself. But the main thing that we look at in those moments in that paradigm, we want to see how the child is responding to the parent going away, and how they respond to the parent coming back. So we do expect the child to react in some way when the parent is going outside, leaves the room and leaves the child alone with the toys or with another person. So and we do expect the child to be in some distress because their attachment figure is going away. And when the parent is coming back, this is where we're looking to see if the child approaches the parent, wants to be consoled by the parent, or sometimes, the avoidant babies are non-responsive. Maybe they don't look at the parent. They like, you look at them and you see, wow, they really handle themselves quite well. And we do expect some kind of reaction, some kind of communication there from the child to the parent. But I would be careful, and I did it myself, and I caught myself doing it when my boy was I think of around 4 years old. I left the house. I went to work, and he was distressed about that. He started crying, and he asked me to stay at home, and I was like, oh wow, what does it mean about his attachment to me? What would it be like when I'll come back? And I had to stop myself and remind myself that this is not a psychology experiment. This is our day-to-day lives. And I would be careful of putting a meaning into those moments, like, oh no, he's insecurely attached. I did something wrong, because this is where we can take it. This is where I took it. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Now I have to fix that. We need to be careful with those places, because this is not a blood test that can give you like a positive or negative result. And also those have some false positives and all that. So we need to be careful when we talk about psychology variables.
Basically, you're discouraging all of the viewers from starting on experimenting on their children. It's a very responsible thing to do.
Please just make sure that you're open and available for them, that this is what they need. Don't make them into an experiment subject, which is something that the father figures of my profession they used to sometimes put their children into into experiments like that. So no, let's not do that.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a great thing for the child to have to go through.
No.
Did you want to go into the other types whilst we're on the topic? Because we've covered
attachment?
avoidant and secure. I think
Yeah,
is
we
the
can.
other one the equivalent to like clingy. Is that not
yeah? So the clingers are we call it anxious attachment, because if the avoidant ones, they act like they don't need anyone because they learned early on not to trust anyone. So they do what we call they are like, the avoidant ones are hypoactivating their attachment behavior. So they don't act according to the attachment behavior, which is calling for help, crying, and all that. The anxious types are hyperactivating their attachment behavior. So this is why we sometimes call them clingy. This is when you can think about two adults in a relationship, a romantic relationship, and one of them is anxiously attached from his or her childhood, and they text their girlfriend and she doesn't respond quickly enough, and then they get stressed and they start to text her over and over again, where are you, why are you not answering? And they make this whole the whole thing in their mind until they get a response that calms them down. So when they're not secure in the moment, they alleviate the volume of their actions more and more and more. This is why we feel like they're clinging to something all the time. So this is the anxiously attached type. Usually it results from parenting that is not balanced in a way. So if the avoidant types are, and I'm talking very categorically right now, so please don't take it like a formula, but usually the avoidant types are is a result of parents who are not very sensitive. They're very dismissive towards the child. So if the child is crying, they might not respond and all that. The anxious type is more a result of parenting that is not balanced. So sometimes the parents are very present and sensitive, and sometimes they are not. So you can develop a rule of I'm loved and taken care of, but you also can develop this rule of there's no one here to trust and I have to take care of myself. You're somewhere in between. So when you lack security, you up the ante and you try to create more attention and to take more attention from your parents and then from your spouse or whatever. And there's a fourth type, which is called disorganized attachment, and that's the minority. And that usually they have they have the worst outcomes eventually. The disorganized, insecure attachment are those children who, when they are insecure, they have no strategy in place. So sometimes they act avoidantly, sometimes they act more clingy, sometimes they're all over the place. So that's the fourth type that was later recognized. And
yeah. Have you noticed any trends in where they are along sort of like first child or youngest child, and how attachment varies based on how far along they are?
No, I can't say that I do, but I have never really checked into the literature on that. I'm quite sure there are some studies that at least try to look into birth order and attachment patterns. But what I can say is that one of the main predictors of attachment in a child is the attachment of his or her parents at the get-go. So when you can take a woman who's pregnant and administer what we call the adult attachment interview to her, and from that gauge her attachment to her parents. Usually that's predictive of the attachment she's going to have with the baby that is not born yet, statistically speaking at least. So I'm not sure if birth order has anything to do about it, but I have never checked that. That's actually something interesting to look for.
Yeah, really interesting, I think.
I think this whole thing has been interesting. So that's got to be good, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you feel that you want to mention which would be valuable to the audience, which we haven't asked you about today?
I don't think so. I maybe I can just sum by saying that I think maybe a word of caution when we talk about, attachment patterns and outcomes. It's easy to get into a place of being very worried about what does it all mean, and how, especially how am I screwing up my child. I've been there. I have, I'm working with people who's been there, and that's a dangerous place to go into, because children are more resilient than we think. And on one hand, on the other hand, we do need to take care of them emotionally, not only physically. So it's not so easy to really screw up your child unless you really treat them badly. The cases where I, as a psychologist working with adults, see people really suffer and really hurt are places where they had a really bad experience in their childhood, with parents who dismissed them, didn't know how to, or didn't care to take care of their emotion lives. I'm not even talking about abusive parents, which I've seen also many cases of. And as long as you care about parenting and being a positive parent and taking sensitive care of your children, and if you listen to this podcast, you probably are a person who cares about that. You're better off than other people, and it's a matter of taking the time to educate yourself and remembering that parenting is not it's not just, there's no one magic bullet, it's not one thing, and there are different types of parents and different types of children. And if you are open and caring and attentive and mindful of how you act, you're in a good place, and you're in a good place in this journey, which is a journey. It doesn't end, it only evolves.
And
Thank you
every
for
journey
that.
needs a map as well.
So. I believe so, yeah.
Is it also true that even if you know, as a psychologist, even if you know exactly what's going on, it's actually quite easy to make it worse? So one of the things you have to be conscious of is, even if you know exactly what is happening, if you tell them the wrong way, or if, it's possible to make things worse for that child or that person. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't think that even psychologists know exactly everything that is going on in themselves, in the children's minds. We are complex creatures, human beings, and the human mind, the human brain is very complex. We don't understand everything yet, and we have learned a lot in the past couple of decades, though. And I'm a parent. I make a lot of mistakes along the way, I think. I promote and I talk about sensitive and non-punitive parenting, and sometimes it doesn't work for me. And this is why I believe we are in an ongoing process here. I do believe that I have the care and the understanding of how to make amends when needed, take responsibility when needed, because I am, as their father and their mother with me, we are their caregivers, their attachment figures. We are what John Bowlby, the originator of this theory, deemed the bigger and wiser. We are there for them, and we have the responsibility. We are the responsible adults. We need to take care of the relationship. If something went wrong, even if it's not because of us, quote unquote, we have to take care of helping us and them go back into a regulated place, a more harmonious place, and it's up to us.
Jake, have you got anything that you'd like to ask or close with?
No, I think the attachment, the whole concept of that and the 4 types that you mentioned earlier on is kind of fascinating and a lot of food for thought. I very much like the concept of a parenting map. I think that's a, you know, seems completely an obvious thing that parents need, some kind of map to plan out what they're doing. But it's reassuring that you know, that even if, you know, that things can change over time, and that you know, just because at one stage you might have a particular a child might be in a particular place in terms of their attachment, that can change and evolve over time. So I think that's really positive stuff, and it's nice to know that even the experts don't always get it right too. So that's makes me feel a bit better about my own parenting skills.
Well, thank you, Eran, for answering our questions they came up in a pretty non-coherent fashion, so I appreciate all the value. And can you let people know where's the best place for people to find you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the best place is going to my website. It's called Apparently Parent, and just go to apparentlyparent.com, and you can listen to my podcast, the Apparently Parent podcast. You can get to it from the website. I'm also on Instagram as Apparently Parent, so sometimes I post things over there. But the main place currently that I'm working on, you know, talking about this stuff, and the main place I put content in is in my podcast, which you can get to from my site. So it's apparentlyparent.com.
Thank you very much for your time today, and I'll speak to you both soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very
much. Thank you so much.